Welcome to the first episode of Orthodontics in Interview, where I bring you closer to the experts in orthodontics so we can hear their story and gain from their experiences. Our first guest is Simon Littlewood. He's an honorary senior lecturer at the University of Leeds and a consultant orthodontist. He's had an illustrious career so far, with 47 publications, including the comprehensive Cochrane systematic review on the topic of retention. He's also authored a textbook, Introduction to Orthodontics, a key text during my training, and I'm sure for most orthodontic trainees out there. So Dr. Simon Littlewood, it's a real pleasure to have you here for our first episode of Orthodontics in Interview.
Hi, Farouk. How are you doing?
I'm well. I just want the listeners to know that we are meeting social distancing guidelines of 2 meters, but exceeding them as well as we connect from London to Yorkshire. So Simon, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, that's a pleasure. Yes, we're safely at least 200 miles apart here, Farouk.
Great. So, Simon, I wanted to ask, I mentioned in the introduction about your Cochrane review. I really want to know what was the story behind it? What led you to do such a large body of work?
Okay, so the Cochrane review. So you're talking about the retention Cochrane review. So let's go back to the millennium, the year 2000. I think a lot of good things have happened to me along the way have really been by luck, a case of just being in the right place at the right time. You often hear people saying that it's important to say no to things, and I really understand this, but actually I'm one of those people that are always worried about missing out. And this is an example where I said yes to something without really realising what I was saying yes to. So back to Manchester in the millennium. I think you trained in Manchester as well, Farouk, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So in 2009, yes.
Okay, so a few years earlier than that, I was in Manchester. I'd already qualified as a specialist, and I was doing my additional 2 years of consultant training. And at that time, Manchester was a real hotbed of big characters in orthodontics. The training director was Jonathan Sandler, who's currently the president of the British Orthodontic Society, of course. He's a brilliant clinician. He was really good to me. We used to sit down and talk about my cases. I would give my plan and he would give his plan, and then we would both agree to go with his plan. He was great. There was a young professor there who was just beginning to make his name doing big multi-centre RCTs, the young Kevin O'Brien. Of course, it was a lucky time to be around. But actually, the most senior professor at the time there was a chap called Bill Shaw. He's retired now, but people might know him through his work on Index of Orthodontic Treatment Need and his cleft research. I think he'd just become the first editor of the Cochrane All Health Group. And he asked me, as one of the senior trainees, if I wanted to be involved. And he said he thought it might be helpful for me. I said yes, really, with absolutely having no idea what it meant. But I trusted that he said it would be useful. And actually what I ended up doing was sitting in the dusty library in Manchester University, evening after evening, hand searching through journals for high quality research. But actually Bill was right. And it taught me so much about understanding high quality research. And then at a later stage, when I mentioned I wanted to do some work on orthodontic retention, the area I think at that stage would be most under-researched, Bill said, yeah, that's a great idea, but you really ought to start with a systematic review. So why don't you do a Cochrane systematic review? So really, it was just a case of being lucky in the right place and the right time. And then I was lucky to be teamed up with a group of other co-authors on the Cochrane review. And I think the first one came out in 2004, and we've updated it 2 or 3 times since then. So the right place at the right time, Farouk, I think.
Wow, that's great. And what a phenomenal piece of work it is. It really does help us know where does the entire literature stand, because there is so much out there. And I thank you for that piece of work. It's really given me insight on how retention works. And then it led on to the BOS, British Orthodontic Society's Hold That Smile campaign, which is 2017, which, as I look at it, was a public health promotion almost. What led you to go into that process?
Yeah, well, the credit to this really goes to the British Orthodontic Society themselves for investing in something like this. I think there was a realisation amongst most clinicians in the country that by this stage we understood orthodontic retention was important, but it didn't seem to have engaged the public fully, and patients still came in, sometimes a bit surprised that we asked them to wear retainers long term. So the idea was to try and kind of target the public rather than educating the profession. We were going to go to the public and try and say, this is what orthodontic retention is, this is what retainers are, this is what you'd have to commit to if you want to have orthodontic treatment. So I think the first ideas for this campaign came from a lady called Caroline Holland, who headed up the media and communications team at the Society at that time. And Caroline was a brilliant listener. She's one of these people, she used to phone me up and she'd ask me just to talk and talk about retention. She didn't say much, she just used to scribble stuff down on the end of the phone. And a couple of days later, she'd come back and she'd ring me again. She said, this is the key information that I think I got out of this. So I'd be babbling on for 45 minutes and she'd managed to get it down to about two minutes of key information. And then from there, she said, right, let's see if we can get this out there. So we sat down and talked about this Hold That Smile campaign, designed a logo for it. And then she brought a film crew up to our department in Bradford one day, which was very exciting. The staff were really excited. In fact, you worked in Bradford at one stage.
I did. I didn't manage to make it into the final cut, though, Simon, so we need to discuss that later on.
Perhaps we will leave that one there. And she came with the film crew to the Bradford department. And actually what she did, she just filmed us for a day talking to patients and getting us to talk to the camera. She didn't want any of it to be scripted, so no one knew what questions were coming up. And she just filmed for a whole day. Now, the impact of that, well, it's difficult to know what the impact was, but certainly she got it all into the national newspapers, and I did 3 or 4 radio interviews. And patients started to come in saying, oh, yeah, we've seen a video on this, or we've seen it on YouTube. And then very recently, I think there was an article published in the Journal of Orthodontics looking at its effect over 9 centres to see if it made a difference when patients watched these videos. And the feedback from this paper was that it seemed to improve patients' attitudes to committing to wearing retainers. But certainly anecdotally, I think our younger patients much prefer to watch a short video about retainers than reading our comprehensive information leaflets. And I think this type of campaign or this type of communication with patients is probably the way forward, rather than giving them leaflets when they leave the department.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, people are so afraid with using their mobile phones from such a small age, and it is how they receive information in some degree. That is almost the main portal.
Yes.
And I think interacting with that is what you did, and thank you for pioneering that process. Simon, you've mentioned a few people on your journey in orthodontics and the things that you've achieved, some you've come into contact with. What I'd really like to know is, who is it that you've admired the most? Maybe it's someone from afar that you've not come into contact with.
Okay. Gosh, that's a difficult one. I'm going to mention a couple of people here. So one orthodontics and one non-orthodontics. So orthodontics-wise, I'm going to mention Laura Mitchell. Laura Mitchell is a name that many people know from her textbooks, not just in orthodontics, but also the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Dentistry. She was my initial trainer and then eventually a consultant colleague. She's retired now, actually. And she was hugely successful in her career with her author work, with her work at the Royal College, some work with the British Orthodontic Society. But what really struck me was she always went about things in the right way. She never clambered over at people. She never used political manoeuvres. She always treated people in the right way. So I admired her ability to become so successful, but doing it in the right way. Now, outside of orthodontics, now, when I talk to people about lecturing or teaching, I always say you should avoid 2 topics. Avoid the topic of religion and avoid the topic of football. And actually, more recently, I've said avoid the topic of Brexit as well, and we certainly don't want to go into that now. But on this occasion, I'm going to break that rule because I'm going to talk about someone from football. And the person I admire outside is Alex Ferguson, the great Manchester United manager. Now, yes. I know hundreds of your listeners now on the podcast will be throwing things at their podcast.
I am as well. I mean, my screen is so robust it survived, but continue, Simon. I won't interrupt.
Well, I know Alex is not everyone's cup of tea. And actually, even for me at times, he's a man that's not easy to like. But I do admire his ability to consistently succeed and stay at the top for years and years. I think it's always easy to be successful in short bursts, but to maintain those high standards all the time, that's what really makes me pick him out as someone I admire.
Yeah, he was and probably still is an institution in football. He was incredible.
Absolutely.
That's really good insight into you and I suppose what inspired you and things that you look up to. Simon, going on to the audience question. So this is where we put the question out to social media. We're interviewing an expert, and what question would you like to ask them? So the question that's come forward is, what retention regime do you advise your patients to do? Probably not an unexpected question, I suppose, in some respects, but what is that you tell patients?
No, it's a really good question, isn't it? And I'm afraid I don't have a magic answer to that. It's probably the question I get asked most. I guess the way I'd answer that is, I don't think there is a perfect retainer or regime. And if there was, we'd all be doing this. What's striking actually is that retention regimens across the world are markedly different, which either means it doesn't matter what we use, or that people need different types of retention. So what I try and do is I do try and tailor the retention to the patient in front of me. So that might depend on the initial malocclusion, the likelihood of the stability of the result, but also a lot of it for me is how well they'll be able to look after, maintain, and care for their retainer long term. So, for instance, if I want to use a bond retainer, I need to be sure that they know how to keep it clean, that they'll get it checked, that they'll need to see a professional regularly to make sure it's fine, be prepared to pay for the cost if it's replaced. Or similarly, if I'm fitting a clear plastic retainer, can I be sure I can motivate this patient enough to continue wearing it? And I think there is not an absolute answer, because a bond retainer, for instance, will be more suitable for one patient, but might not be suitable to the personality of another. So it really is a genuine personalised choice for each patient in front of me.
I really like that. So it's not just the application of evidence-based practice from just research, it's also the patient factors. And I think that's making such a bigger play in research in orthodontics at the moment.
Yeah.
You do need to take into account the patient in that decision-making process. It is so important.
Completely. We talk about evidence-based care, don't we? And we always think of the science part of that. But there's also the clinical expertise, and a big chunk of it is the patient factors as well. And in retention, it's even more important, because actually this is really out of our control. Once we discharge patients, it's up to the patient. So the patient's values and motivations and compliance almost overrides the other bits as well. So that's why in retention, it really has to be tailored to the individual patient.
Simon, that's really insightful to hear from an expert on the field and who has published on the research, the scientific side of things, actually in the clinical practice is using other parameters as well. That's so insightful. So I'm just going to conclude with one final question, and it is, what piece of advice would you give orthodontists out there?
Wow, I'm not sure I'm the man for that job, but okay, I guess I think we all need to remember to continue to enjoy what we do. I think we're all better at jobs if we enjoy it. I think there are very few jobs that are as mentally challenging in a good way on a daily basis as orthodontics is. And unlike some other areas of clinical care, in fact, lots of other areas of clinical work, in orthodontics it's usually possible to get good results and, importantly, have predictably happy patients. And there's nothing more important, of course, for a clinician than making sure they can get the patient happy at the end of treatment.
That's amazing. Simon, I'd like to thank you so much for being part of this first episode of Orthodontics in Interview, for making it possible. I'd like to also thank the listeners who have helped to bring this podcast into being. And please do subscribe and look forward to the next episode. Thank you so much.